At 6:42 on the morning of January 17th, 1943, the jungle west of the Matanikau River was still half asleep. A grey mist clung to the tops of the coconut palms. The ground was wet, soft, and cold from night rain, and the smell of rotting vegetation hung in the air like something physical. Private First Class Daniel Harper lay flat against the damp slope, overlooking the groves, elbows set into the mud, cheek pressed to the stock of a rifle no one else in his platoon believed in. Crickets buzzed. A bird called once, sharply, then went silent again. The sky was turning the dull colour of tin. Harper's breathing stayed slow, controlled. He had been in position for 30 minutes already, watching the treetops through a civilian Noski 4-power scope mounted to a Winchester Model 54 rifle that, in the eyes of his fellow soldiers, had no business on a battlefield. The Garand was the accepted standard semi-automatic, 8 rounds, reliable in heat and mud. Harper's rifle was lighter, bolt action, and looked more suited to deer stands than Pacific jungles. Most of the men had laughed when he unpacked it months earlier at Camp White. They laughed again on the transport ship. Harper never responded. He only cleaned the weapon, polished the scope glass, checked his zero, and kept to himself. Below him, the groves lay quiet, too quiet for Guadalcanal. The battalion had pushed into this area the previous day, hoping to clear remaining Japanese holdouts. Instead, they walked into carefully concealed sniper fire. 6 men died before noon. 3 more fell before dusk. The snipers had no fixed positions. They climbed into the massive banyan trees scattered throughout the groves, trees 70 to 90 feet tall with thick, twisting branches that formed natural hides high above the ground. A sniper could climb before dawn and sit motionless until dark, invisible to anyone walking below. Harper's job was to find them. He kept his left hand on the forestock, his right shoulder pressed firmly against the butt. The rifle weighed just under 8 pounds, the scope adding barely a few ounces. It felt light, almost too light, compared to the Garand, but the balance was right. The bolt cycled smooth. The trigger broke at 2.5 pounds clean, predictable, and Harper trusted it. A faint breeze stirred the tops of the palms. Harper shifted his focus, scanning left to right, checking the thinner branches first. Snipers often preferred height over comfort. The higher they climbed, the better their view of American supply routes. But the higher they climbed, the more they risked movement, exposing them against patches of sky. Movement was all Harper needed. He watched a cluster of banyans 200 yards out. Nothing. Then another cluster to the north. Nothing. A third one, closer, where one of yesterday's shots had come from. Still nothing. The jungle sounds rose and fell in small waves, insects chirping. A distant thump of artillery, the soft pop of coconuts falling somewhere unseen. Harper let the noise fade into the background. He looked for shifts, shadows that didn't belong, leaves bending against gravity, a silhouette that didn't match branch angles. Then he saw it, barely a tremor, 85 feet up, in a banyan 260 yards from his position. A single branch moved against still air. No wind, no birds, just the subtle shift of weight. Harper's breath slowed even more. His heartbeat felt like another sound he needed to silence. He adjusted the scope and saw it not a full figure, not a face, just the faint shape of a helmet rim and the suggestion of a shoulder tucked into a fork of 3 thick branches. The sniper was facing east, watching the trail that American supply carriers would walk in less than an hour. Harper placed the crosshairs a fraction low to compensate for angle and distance. He exhaled. The jungle around him seemed to hold its breath as well. This was where the story began, with a rifle everyone mocked and a man who refused to put it down. When Daniel Harper first opened the long cardboard shipping box back at Camp White in Oregon, nobody gathered around him expected anything impressive. Soldiers had rifles mailed to them occasionally, usually hunting pieces sent by family or brought from home. Most were put away after a day or two novelties that didn't stand up to military requirements. Harper's rifle drew attention for a different reason. It looked too clean, too polished, too civilian. The Winchester Model 54 rested inside a layer of old butcher paper, packed in a way that suggested care rather than urgency. The walnut stock carried a smooth satin sheen. The bolt shone with a mirror-like finish. The Noske 4 power scope, mounted with 2 carefully machined rings, gave the whole setup an almost delicate appearance. It did not look like something meant for jungles, mud, or the recoil-heavy pace of infantry combat. "Where'd you order that, Sears catalogue?" someone called out. "Squirrels trembling across the whole Pacific," another joked. Harper didn't answer. He peeled away the paper, checked the stock, inspected the sling mounts. The rifle weighed less than a Garand, balanced better, fit tighter in the shoulder, but nobody cared about that. At Camp White, confidence belonged to the M, one solid, semi-automatic, rugged, capable of spitting 8 rounds fast enough to keep a man alive when ambushed. In comparison, Harper's bolt-action rifle seemed slow, underfed, and laughably personal. A mail-order sweetheart, as Corporal Madsen liked to call it. Something you take hunting with your father, not into a war. The armourer didn't even hide his skepticism. He lifted the rifle, turned it over once, and frowned at the engraved floor plate. "You deploying with this?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Harper replied. "This is a sporting rifle," the armourer said flatly. "Yes, sir. War's different." Harper nodded but said nothing. He'd heard the same thing before. Good shooters always heard it. Most competition men did. But Harper wasn't a braggart. He wasn't the type to recite scores or trophies. He kept his head down and focused on maintenance. Every evening after drills, he stripped the Winchester down, cleaned the bore, oiled the bolt, and checked the bedding screws. He zeroed the Noske scope at 300 yards on the outdoor range, making careful wind corrections. A few other marksmen noticed the tight groups his rifle produced, but they still dismissed it as impractical for combat. Too tight tolerance, they said. Too clean for the Pacific. The jungle would chew it up. Harper let them talk. During transport to Guadalcanal, men sat on deck cleaning their Garands, tapping carbon from the gas cylinders, comparing serial numbers and service dates. Harper kept his Winchester wrapped in cloth, packed away to prevent salt exposure. No one asked to see it. No one cared. Why would they? The Pacific was brutal. Mud, rust, humidity, mold, all of it punished rifles relentlessly. A delicate bolt action seemed like a liability, not an asset. Then, the battalion landed. Guadalcanal wasn't like the training grounds back in Oregon. The air was thicker. The ground rotted faster. Everything smelled like decay. Harper kept the rifle dry as best he could, checking the scope mounts each night despite the jokes. He knew what the weapon could do. He knew its limitations. He knew its strengths. The others only saw a farm rifle with polished wood and a civilian scope. That changed the moment Japanese snipers began killing Americans at 200, 300, even 400 yards from trees no one else thought to look at. The Garand was a magnificent battle rifle, but it wasn't designed for precision fire at small silhouettes hidden in foliage 100 feet above the ground. The platoon had skill, but they had no glass, no magnification, no trained sniper section. For the first time since he arrived in the Pacific, Harper saw something in their eyes when they glanced at his rifle. Not mockery, need. But the shift didn't fully register until the battalion commander summoned him personally, pointed at the polished Winchester, and asked the question that changed everything. "Can that thing actually hit what you're aiming at?" Harper didn't brag, didn't smile, didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir," he said. "It can." The first day the battalion pushed west of the Matanikau River. Everything seemed routine. The Marines had already fought through most of this ground months earlier. They had taken Henderson Field. They had pushed the Japanese back. The army units taking over the sector expected scattered pockets of resistance, nothing more than a few stragglers left behind to harass patrols. But by mid-afternoon on January 15th, 1943, the illusion collapsed with the unmistakable crack of a single, distant rifle shot. Sergeant Weller was dead before anyone knew what happened. He had crouched to pick up a dropped canteen near a stand of palms when the bullet entered just under his left arm, passed through both lungs, and dropped him face first into the mud. A second man rushed forward to drag him back. and another shot tore through his pack straps inches from his spine. The men pulled back, unsure where the fire was coming from, scanning the tree line with rifles raised, breathing hard, seeing nothing. The jungle swallowed the sound almost instantly. By dusk, 3 more men had fallen, each from a single, precise shot delivered from what seemed like impossible angles. One was hit while stepping across a shallow stream, another while relieving himself behind a log. The last died standing guard near a supply trail, struck cleanly through the neck. No one saw muzzle flash, no one spotted movement. The battalion moved into defensive positions that night with unease settling over them like the descending humidity. The Japanese had snipers in the groves, and they were good. The next morning brought no clarity. One squad advanced cautiously along a ridge. Another patrolled south toward a cluster of banyan trees. Every few minutes, men raised binoculars, searching the branches, but most of the treetops blended together in a continuous green canopy. The trunks were massive, their roots bulging through the earth like ribs. The enemy had the advantage of height, concealment, and patience. At noon, a shot dropped Private Ortega while he filled a sandbag. He fell backward into the half-packed pile of earth, arms still limp around the burlap sack. By evening, the battalion commander called for a staff meeting inside a rough, hastily cleared command post. Damp maps lay spread across a crate. Cigarette smoke clouded the space. Officers argued over possibilities, tree platforms, spider holes, forward pickets, but no two agreed on the solution. Their rifles were reliable at 100 yards, maybe 200 if the shot was clean, but they had nothing capable of picking out a silhouette 100 feet up and 200 yards away. That was when Harper arrived. He stood quietly near the entrance, rifle in hand, muddy boots dripping onto the floor. Someone scoffed under his breath when they saw the polished walnut stock, but the commander looked directly at him, expression flat. "You brought that civilian rifle all the way out here," he said. "The men say you can shoot." "Yes, sir," Harper replied. "How far?" Harper answered without blinking. 300, further if I know the wind." The room fell quiet. The commander stepped aside from the map table and motioned Harper closer. "My men are dying," he said plainly. "I don't care what that rifle looks like. I care whether it can hit what's killing them." Harper laid the Winchester gently on the crate. The Nosk scope caught the lantern light. The weapon looked out of place among the muddy helmets and olive-drab gear surrounding it, too refined, too precise, too personal. But war didn't care about appearances. "Dawn," the commander said. "You get one chance. Show me that rifle works." Harper nodded. He picked up the Winchester and left the tent without another word. The meeting resumed behind him, voices rising again in frustration and uncertainty. Outside, the jungle crackled with insects. A faint breeze stirred the palm fronds. Somewhere in the groves, a Japanese sniper shifted in a high branch, preparing to kill again at first light. Harper tightened the sling on his rifle. Tomorrow, he would be waiting for him. Dawn on January 17th, 1943, came in quietly, the kind of dense grey morning that made the Guadalcanal jungle look older than the war being fought inside it. Mist hung low, drifting between the branching silhouettes of banyan trees. The humidity had already begun to climb, coating everything, rifles, uniforms, skin with an oily sheen. Private First Class Daniel Harper settled deep into the damp soil of the slope overlooking the groves and adjusted the noskoscope mounted to his Winchester. The battalion was still waking up behind him, their movements muffled by distance and terrain, but Harper had been awake long before the sun rose. He had crawled into position under darkness, moving slowly, flattening his profile against the ground, keeping each breath shallow. The earth was cold and slick under his elbows. Mud seeped into his sleeves. Ants crawled across his forearms. He didn't move. At 6:42, the light shifted just enough to distinguish distinct layers of canopy. Harper began his glassing routine left to right, top to bottom, sweeping every major branch fork within 300 yards. It was slow work, deliberate, methodical. A scope had narrow vision. It forced tunnel sight. A single oversight could mean death. He had scanned the grove twice when he found it. A shape, not a clear one. just a small irregularity 85 feet up a banyan tree, roughly 260 yards away. Something about the weight distribution of the branches looked wrong, slightly too rigid, slightly too anchored. Harper stayed on the area, waiting for confirmation. At 7:14 a.m., it came. A shift. Barely a tremor, but it wasn't wind. It was too intentional, too controlled. Harper adjusted the elevation dial on the Noske scope by 2 clicks, exhaled long and slow through his nose, and let the crosshairs float onto the faint outline of a helmet rim, half concealed by banyan leaves. He steadied his breathing. 1 breath, 2, a third. Then he tightened his finger against the trigger. The rifle cracked across the groves. The recoil punched straight back into his shoulder, clean, expected, manageable. Through the scope, he saw a sudden drop of motion as the silhouette jerked, then fell, hitting branches on the way down like a sack of grain striking wooden beams. The body hit the ground hard, collapsing into underbrush in a cloud of dust and shredded leaves. Harper didn't linger. He worked the bolt immediately, sliding brass free of the chamber with practiced smoothness. The hot casing landed near his left wrist, hissing against the wet ground. If the sniper had a partner, and experienced Japanese marksmen often operated in pairs, that partner would be moving. Harper scanned the adjacent trees. He avoided the natural impulse to recheck the same branches repeatedly. Instead, he widened his search, sweeping a 70-yard radius around the first kill site. At 7:29 a.m., he caught movement north of the banyan, another shape. This one, descending the trunk quickly, half sliding, half climbing in reverse. The sniper was evacuating his hide. He had heard the shot and knew he was compromised. Harper led the movement. He placed the crosshairs 2 inches ahead of where the man's torso would pass. Breath in, pause, shot. The second sniper fell backward off the branch, limbs snapping outward before he tumbled through foliage. His rifle clattered against the bark with metallic resonance before disappearing into the undergrowth below. 2 shots, 2 kills, 28 minutes apart. The groves grew silent for a few long seconds, the kind of silence that felt intentional. Harper didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just reloaded the rifle with a slow, practiced motion and resumed scanning. In the distance, the battalion stirred, unaware that the morning's balance had already shifted. But someone else knew. Somewhere among the trees, another Japanese sniper adjusted his position, re-evaluating the threat. Harper could feel it, even if he couldn't yet see it. The duel had only just begun. The 2 dead snipers hit the ground within half an hour of each other, but their absence didn't make the groves any safer. It made them quieter in a way that felt unnatural. Harper stayed low behind the slight rise of ground, letting the jungle's usual sounds return: birds, insects, the distant cough of a mule in the rear lines. Nothing in that mix sounded urgent, but Harper had hunted long enough to know that silence was rarely accidental. Something out there was watching him. At 8:11 a.m., the jungle reminded him. A single rifle report cracked from the southwest, sharp and precise. The round hit the soil 3 inches from Harper's cheek, exploding upward in a spray of dirt and gritty mud that peppered the side of his face. He didn't flinch. He didn't jerk his rifle or snap upright. He rolled flat, controlled to the left, sliding his body behind a shallow depression and pressing himself tight against the earth. The shot told him 2 things immediately. The Japanese sniper had range, and he had angle. The position wasn't random. It was calculated. Harper counted silently, letting his pulse settle. He reached the number 30 before easing the Noske scope above the ground, keeping the barrel low. He didn't search for the muzzle flash. There wouldn't be one in dense foliage. He searched for the only thing snipers couldn't fully suppress: displacement. Leaves shifted. Birds startled. Branches held tension differently after a shot. Harper scanned the southwest quadrant, methodically slicing the grove into invisible grid sections. It took him nearly 15 minutes to find it a shape perched 72 feet up, nestled among angled banyan limbs in a 4-tree cluster. The sniper had wedged himself between vines and roots, a location that offered concealment from 3 sides and only one narrow angle of approach. Harper, happened to be lying in that angle. He exhaled slowly, adjusted elevation, placed the reticle just right of center. The shot broke clean. The Japanese sniper slumped sideways, his weight pulling him out of the makeshift hide. He dropped without a sound, falling through vines like a shadow stripped from a branch. 3 kills. The jungle paused again, but not with fear, more like recalculation. Harper wiped the dirt from his cheek with the edge of his sleeve, slid the bolt back, chambered another round, and went still. For several seconds, nothing stirred. Then something shifted far to the north, subtle, faint, but enough to prick instinct. At 9:01 a.m., he caught the silhouette of another sniper adjusting position, half hidden behind a thick curtain of banyan leaves. The man had been watching the tree where Harper had taken his second shot. He hadn't yet triangulated the new threat. Harper squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit center mass. The figure sagged, then disappeared into the underbrush. 16 minutes later, another sniper revealed himself, just a slight lean, a shift of shoulder. Maybe the beginning of a reposition move. Harper caught it, fired once. The man fell. 5 kills before noon. Word of what was happening slipped through the battalion with a kind of cautious disbelief. The men who had mocked Harper's rifle began drifting to the ridgeline in small groups, trying to catch a glimpse of what they had dismissed as a farm boy's affectation. Harper refused them. A single silhouette, a voice, a cough. Even the glint of a helmet could draw sniper fire. He waved them off each time, eyes never leaving the treetops. But even without spectators, the jungle was watching him. With 5 of their number dead, the Japanese adjusted tactics. They stopped shifting during daylight. They pressed themselves deep into the upper branches, hiding behind vines and shadow. Their angles stayed tight. Their silhouettes vanished against the canopy. By late afternoon, Harper's scope revealed nothing at all, no movement, no tremors, not even careless weight shifts. He studied the trees until his vision blurred, but the groves refused to give up another target. The snipers had learned. Tomorrow they would be harder, and Harper knew the jungle would be watching him back with even greater patience. By late afternoon on January 17th, the groves felt different. The air hadn't changed, still thick, still humid, still carrying the sweet rot of fallen coconuts, but the behavior of the jungle had. It felt tighter, more controlled. The Japanese snipers no longer revealed themselves with the tiny movements that gave away their hides earlier in the day. The banyan branches that once betrayed shapes now held perfectly still. Harper remained on the slope long after the sun began dipping toward the western tree line. His elbows were sunk deep into the damp earth, his forearms muddy to the wrist, yet he barely shifted his weight. Snipers often died because they became impatient, or because they convinced themselves nothing more would happen. Harper wasn't willing to make that mistake. He kept scanning slow, deliberate sweeps of the Nosuke scope. Every inch of canopy received the same attention as it had at dawn, but nothing moved. The stillness was unnatural, almost studied. Harper recognized the pattern. The surviving snipers were adapting. The first 5 kills had taught them that movement meant exposure, exposure meant death. The Japanese marksmen were now relying on complete immobility. Their bodies pressed into the natural shapes of the banyan limbs. Their rifles angled with vines and roots to break outlines. They weren't shifting position, they weren't adjusting, they were waiting. Harper respected that. Only trained shooters did this, men who knew the consequences of revealing themselves by so much as tightening a shoulder. These snipers were patient, experienced, determined to survive the day. The battalion commander sent a runner around 1,500 hours with a simple question. Any more? Harper didn't look away from the scope. Not yet. The runner hesitated, then left, his boots sinking softly as he disappeared back up the slope. Behind Harper, the distant thump of crates and the murmur of low voices signaled the battalion establishing evening camp. Fires wouldn't be lit. Not here. Not under threat of rifles positioned high in trees. Harper knew they were being watched. He could feel it, not paranoia, not nerves, but instinct, sharpened by years of hunting back home. He'd felt the same sensation when coyotes circled his family's fields at dusk, silent and invisible but undeniably present. The Japanese were doing the same thing now. They were studying him. At 1,630, the light shifted just enough to cast vertical shadows through the groves. This should have helped long shadows, often distorted silhouettes, and could reveal outlines when soldiers adjusted to stay comfortable. But the snipers didn't adjust. Not once. Harper stayed until the edges of his vision began to darken. When he finally eased himself off the slope, his muscles ached from the static tension of the day. He kept his rifle low as he backed away from the firing position. Every movement was measured. Even retreat needed discipline. By the time he reached the company perimeter, the air had cooled by a few degrees. Men were seated under ponchos, muttering quietly, checking gear, writing letters by the last light. They looked up when Harper passed, not with jokes this time, but with something closer to cautious respect. "What do you see?" someone asked. "Not enough," Harper replied. He cleaned the Winchester in silence, running oily patches through the bore until they came out clean, wiping moisture from the Noska's lenses, checking the bolt face for grit. Around him, the jungle's nighttime sounds rose, frogs, crickets, the distant rumble of artillery. But he knew the snipers weren't gone. They were watching, waiting, learning. Tomorrow would be harder. The enemy would be smarter. The angles would be tighter, and the margin for error smaller than ever. Harper closed the bolt with a quiet metallic click. The duel was far from over. The sky opened before dawn on January 18th, 1943. Not the light, intermittent drizzle the men had grown used to, but a heavy tropical downpour that hammered the groves with the force of a steady drumbeat. Rain poured from the canopy in thick curtains. Water cascaded down the slope, forming rivulets that soaked through boots, webbing, rifle stocks, and uniforms. Visibility collapsed to less than 100 yards. The air smelled of wet earth, decaying fronds, and the lingering metallic tang of spent gunpowder from the day before. Harper moved into position long before the light improved. He crawled across mud that clung to his elbows like glue and pressed himself into the same shallow depression he had used the previous morning, only now it was half filled with water. His sleeves were drenched before he even settled in. The cold seeped through cloth into skin, but he ignored it. Rain was an ally as much as it was an obstacle. It masked sound, it hid movement, and more importantly, it could hide the approach of a man willing to climb a banyan tree while the storm drowned every noise beneath it. The Japanese knew this. Harper waited, motionless, except for the controlled tightening of his left hand around the Winchester's forestock. Droplets slid down the length of the Noske scope and gathered on the objective lens in small, trembling beads. He wiped them away carefully with a strip of cloth he kept tied to his sling. The scope fogged slightly around the edges, but the central glass remained clear. Rain made the jungle feel claustrophobic. It muffled everything except itself, but slowly, the downpour eased, first into a steady fall, then into a light patter. At 8:32, grey shapes of distant trees began to separate themselves from the haze. At 8:45, Harper had enough clarity to work. He began scanning the canopy. Nothing revealed itself at first. Everything was still saturated with motion. Heavy fronds bowed under the weight of water. Branches swayed from the storm's aftershocks. The Japanese could be anywhere, or nowhere. Rain encouraged repositioning. It hid footholds and handholds. It also hid the sound of someone climbing to a new vantage point. Harper kept sweeping. At 8:56, something caught his eye, a thin line of contrast where none should exist. A dark horizontal sliver, barely visible, high in the crown of a banyan tree nearly 290 yards out. It wasn't movement that gave it away. It was geometry. The line was too straight, too even. Nature didn't grow perfect horizontals in a canopy this chaotic. Harper steadied the crosshairs. There, just behind a curtain of dripping leaves, was the faintest curve of a helmet. The upper third of a Japanese soldier's head tucked behind a branch, wide enough to support a prone position. This sniper was positioned higher and farther than the others. Smarter, more cautious. The storm had given him freedom to climb unseen, and he used it to gain a vantage beyond the usual ranges the Americans could counter. Harper adjusted his elevation dial. 2 clicks, then one more. At this distance, the 30-06 round would drop several inches, and the rain-swelled air would drag on its velocity. He calculated in silence, breath steady. He exhaled. The crack of the Winchester echoed sharper across the groves than the previous day, the air thinner, cleaner after the storm. Through the scope he saw a subtle shudder. Then the shape slumped sideways. The sixth sniper fell, but unlike the others, he didn't tumble cleanly. His body snagged on vines, hanging for a moment before sliding free and dropping through the layers of branches until it struck the ground with a distant, muted thud. Harper didn't celebrate. He reloaded with deliberate calm, chambering a fresh round. The rain had given him an opening, and he had seized it. But he also knew something else. By killing a sniper at nearly 300 yards, he had just revealed his true capability, and the Japanese would not let that go unanswered. The sixth sniper had barely hit the ground before Harper understood the consequence. Killing an enemy concealed at nearly 300 yards wasn't simply another tally. It was a signal, a message. The Japanese now knew they were facing someone who could reach farther than the average American rifleman, someone who could see deeper into the foliage, someone who could kill from distances that should have offered safety. And they would adapt. Snipers were patient. Infantry was not. At 9:57 a.m., the first mortar round landed. It came in low, a muted whistle swallowed by the density of the grove. Then a sudden concussion erupted 40 yards short of Harper's position, sending a column of soil, roots, and torn vegetation straight upward. The shockwave rippled through the wet ground under Harper's elbows. He didn't lift his head, didn't look around. Mortars worked in patterns. Ranging shots came first. The second round hit closer, 20 yards short, a deeper concussion, more force. Harper felt the blast in his chest, a heavy inward push like a giant hand slamming the air forward. They were walking the rounds toward him. Harper didn't rush. Panic got men killed faster than artillery. He slid backward from his firing position, keeping his body tight to the ground, rifle hugged to his chest. He counted his breaths, counted the seconds between detonations. The Japanese mortar crew was disciplined under better conditions. They might have corrected their aim in seconds, but the jungle made everything slower. At 10-2, the third round landed. It hit exactly where Harper had been lying less than 8 seconds earlier. The explosion tore apart the shallow depression, obliterating the mud and fern cover, shredding the nearby foliage into a cloud of dark debris. Chunks of earth and rock slammed into tree trunks with heavy thumps. Splinters of wood snapped through the air like shrapnel. Harper didn't look back. He was already moving. He sprinted north along the slope, slipping once in the mud but catching himself on a root. The Winchester felt heavier in his hands, not from weight, but from the awareness that it had become a beacon, the one piece of equipment that marked him as the target worth killing. 30 yards ahead lay a fallen tree the Marines had used weeks earlier as cover. Harper dove behind it as another salvo crashed into the ground, this time even closer, tracing the line of his movement. The mortar team was adjusting again. He pressed his body into the earth, breath steadying, mud and water soaking through his uniform. When the next 2 rounds landed, one far short, one wide to the right, Harper understood the pattern. The Japanese had lost him. They were searching blindly. By 10:19, the bombardment stopped. Silence returned to the groves, but it wasn't the normal, living silence of insects and distant birds. It was heavy, expectant. The mortars had been phase 1. The snipers would be phase 2. Harper rolled into a new, prone stance, resting the Winchester on the fallen trunk. His left sleeve was soaked and streaked with black soil. He flicked his thumb across the Noski's objective lens to clear a smear of mud. The glass was intact. The rifle was still straight. Now he watched. At 10:33, movement revealed itself a small disturbance, barely a ripple in the foliage, 70 yards west of where the mortars had bracketed him. Harper centered the scope. A dark shape, a figure repositioning, a sniper shifting hides after the concussions. Not cautious enough. Harper fired. The shot cut clean through the humid air. The figure toppled from its perch in a slow, almost weightless fall. Another sniper dead. Harper worked the bolt, chambered another round, and resumed scanning. The groves were shifting again, the enemy adapting in ways only practiced marksmen could. And somewhere in that slow, methodical pattern of movement, another rifle was searching for him. At 11:14, the shadow appeared high, angled, perfectly still until the sun shifted. Harper squeezed the trigger, body down, 8 kills. Mortars hadn't chased him away. Snipers hadn't scared him off. But they weren't done. Tomorrow, the battle would tighten even further, and Harper knew he had now become their priority target. January 19th brought no clarity, only heavier tension. The rain had stopped during the night, but the after effects lingered. The groves held the kind of saturated silence that felt engineered rather than natural. Water dripped steadily from the higher branches. Thin mist clung low to the forest floor. The light was slow to rise, muted by the weight of the canopy. Harper arrived at his new firing position before dawn, a shallow depression south of his earlier hides, chosen specifically to break the pattern he knew the Japanese were studying. He moved through the mud with deliberate care, brushing aside fronds that could leave traces. He settled into the depression, shoulders nestled into the earth, rifle angled upward along the lip of the small rise. Here, he was just high enough to see into the tops of the palms, without exposing himself above the horizon line. He checked the Winchester. Clean, bolt, smooth, scope lenses clear. 5 rounds in the magazine. By 7:40, the light had improved enough for serious work. Harper began scanning with the same slow discipline he had used since the first day, left to right, top to bottom, ignoring the urge to recheck familiar branches. Every square inch of canopy received equal scrutiny. At 8:07, he saw something unusual. A sniper. Low. Too low. 40 feet up a palm tree, only 190 yards away, a dark shape sat nestled among fronds that formed a natural cradle. The figure was almost perfectly obscured from the ground, but Harper wasn't at ground level. From where he lay, elevated on the depression's incline, he could see down into the fronds. He could see the helmet curve, the shoulders, the rifle orientation. Everything about the position was clear. Too clear. Harper stayed motionless. He checked angles, distances, background geometry. Something about the hide bothered him. Japanese snipers rarely positioned themselves this low, unless they had no alternative. A low perch meant being within grenade range. It meant reduced visibility. It meant vulnerability. It also meant bait. Harper didn't move the rifle. He didn't adjust the scope. Instead, he widened his search. If the palm tree sniper was bait, the real threat would be watching the palm, waiting for a muzzle flash, waiting for a response, waiting for the slightest glint of a scope. At 8:13, Harper found it. 90 feet up a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, partially concealed by tangled vines and broad leaves, lay the silhouette he expected a veteran sniper in a nearly perfect hide. This one had elevation, concealment from 3 sides, and a clear line of sight to Harper's previous positions. He was watching the palm tree intently. Harper made a decision that required no debate. He aimed at the bait. He placed the crosshairs on the low palm sniper, adjusted for wind, and fired. The figure jerked violently, falling through the fronds in a spill of broken leaves. Harper was already moving. The Winchester's bolt snapped back, brass ejected. A new round slid into the chamber. He swung the rifle toward the banyan's high perch, movement exactly what he needed. The real sniper had turned toward the sound of Harper's shot, a reflexive action trained into every marksman. That turn created a momentary flicker of motion in the canopy, the exact kind Harper was trained to catch. He fired. The round struck clean. The sniper collapsed sideways, sliding down the vines before dropping free into the branches below. 2 shots. 2 kills, 10 confirmed. Harper didn't wait to admire the results. Experience told him the Japanese never allowed 2 deaths to go unanswered. He grabbed his rifle and low-crawled east, body flat, movements controlled. At 8:24, the world erupted. A burst of Japanese machine gun fire tore across the ridge, shredding the brush at Harper's former firing position. Dirt kicked up in violent spurts. Leaves exploded. Chunks of bark flew. The barrage lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, the jungle fell silent again. Harper lay still in the mud, breath steady, rifle clutched tight. He had outshot them again, but they were adapting faster now. The calm, distant duel of the first day had transformed into something more aggressive, more coordinated, more dangerous. There were only a few snipers left, and the survivors now understood exactly how lethal he was. The machine gun burst that shredded Harper's previous firing position ended as abruptly as it began, leaving only drifting smoke and a faint metallic echo rolling through the groves. Harper stayed prone in the mud, body pressed into the earth, the Winchester held flat against his chest. The sudden silence felt heavier than the gunfire. The Japanese gunners had fired at where they thought he was, not where he actually lay, and that mistake had saved his life. But it also meant something else. They would try again, and they would not make the same assumption twice. Harper crawled slowly east, sliding his elbows through slick mud until he reached a drainage ditch partially filled with stagnant rainwater. The ditch ran north-south like a natural trench, its sides sloped and lined with moss. Harper eased himself in, water rising to his chest. The position was miserable, cold, muddy, exposed from the rear, but it hid him. He steadied his breathing and raised the Noske scope just above the rim. The snipers didn't reveal themselves immediately. The upper branches of the banyans remained still, the palm fronds unmoved, except for the gentle settling of damaged leaves from the earlier gunfire. Harper scanned with slow, deliberate sweeps. After the bait and kill maneuver he had executed minutes earlier, the Japanese would be operating with heightened paranoia. They would be expecting a countershot if they exposed themselves. No one would move until they believed the threat had shifted. They believed it had. At 9:46, Harper caught the first sign, not in the trees, but on the ground. A shape slid between ferns, low and deliberate. 40 yards south of his earlier position, a Japanese sniper crawled across the undergrowth, staying below the line of fallen logs and thick vines. The man moved with precision. Lift knee, pull forward, flatten body, pause. He was searching the ground Harper had abandoned after the machine gun burst. He wasn't scanning upward. He wasn't hunting the treetops. He was hunting Harper's escape path, the one he should have taken. Logically, if he were fleeing the roar of a Type 92 heavy machine gun. The sniper reached the rocks where Harper had lain earlier. He brought up his Arisaka rifle and began studying the drainage ditch, the most predictable escape location. Harper had him in perfect view. 38 yards, broadside, a simple shot. He didn't take it. It was too easy, too staged. The angle, the exposure, the timing, none of it matched the discipline of a sniper who had survived this long. The man at the rocks wasn't careless. He was bait. Harper widened his scan. At 10:06, he found the real threat. 70 yards northwest of the rocks, pressed behind a fallen tree trunk, lay another Japanese soldier, motionless, rifle braced, watching the ditch through a narrow sliver between roots. This one wasn't moving, wasn't shifting, wasn't repositioning. He was waiting for Harper to reveal himself by firing at the bait. 2 men, working in a coordinated sweep, 1 decoy, 1 executioner. They had learned from the palm tree trap, and now they were applying their own version. Harper lowered his head beneath the waterline, leaving only his eyes exposed. The 2 Japanese soldiers signaled quietly to each other. The bait sniper rose from the rocks and began moving east in a slow, sweeping arc, searching the brushline where Harper should have retreated. The second man behind the log mirrored the motion at a distance, maintaining a staggered formation. They were executing a textbook flush. Harper waited, let them pass. When both men moved beyond his position, backs exposed, Harper rose from the water, mud and runoff cascading down his uniform. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, steadied the reticle on the closest figure 42 yards away, and fired. The man fell immediately. Harper worked the bolt, swung the rifle toward the second sniper. The man was already turning, raising his Arisaka. Harper fired first. The second body collapsed behind the log, rifle tumbling from his grip. 11 kills, but the victory lasted less than 5 seconds. Voices erupted from the tree line, sharp, urgent, overlapping in Japanese. Multiple men. Not snipers, infantry. A recovery team or patrol pushed forward by the sound of the shots. Harper froze, water dripping from his chin, the Winchester held tight. He had killed their last snipers. Now the jungle would send something else. The voices came first, fast, overlapping, and too numerous to count accurately. Harper stayed half submerged in the drainage ditch, water lapping against his ribs, the Winchester held vertically to keep the barrel clear. The snipers had been methodical, controlled, disciplined. The infantry was none of those things. They advanced with urgency, their boots snapping branches and disturbing the undergrowth, their rifles clattering softly as they moved. These were not hunters in the trees. These were men sent to recover bodies or avenge them. Harper sank lower into the water, only his eyes and the bridge of his nose breaking the surface. He kept the Winchester pressed to his chest, bolt handle angled upward. Mud clung to his uniform. Each breath had to be silent. Even a ripple could reveal him. At 10:28, the voices reached the bodies of the two snipers Harper had just killed. He heard the tone shift, sharp exclamations, a barked order, gear rattling as someone knelt. Then came another voice, closer, tracing the line of footprints through the mud. Harper's boots, his tracks. He had forgotten about them. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the rim of the ditch. The man peered downward, scanning the dark pool. His eyes moved left, then right. Then they froze. Harper didn't think. Training and instinct aligned in one motion. He drove the Winchester upward until the muzzle cleared the waterline, centered the reticle on the man's torso, and fired from the ditch. The muzzle blast shattered the water's surface, sending a spray of droplets into the air. The rifle kicked against Harper's shoulder, under the resistance of water, heavier and slower than normal, but functional. The soldier staggered backward and fell out of sight. Two more silhouettes appeared at the rim almost instantly. Harper cycled the bolt underwater, the action grinding through resistance, then thrust the rifle upward again. He fired. One fell. He worked the bolt once more, chambered his final round, and fired again. The third body toppled sideways, rolling down the embankment in a slump of wet fabric and tangled vines. Harper had 2 rounds left. Shouting erupted from multiple directions. Branches snapped, boots pounded the earth. The Japanese infantry had fanned out in a loose pincer, approaching from the south and the east. Harper had seconds, maybe less, before men with semi-automatic rifles poured fire into the ditch. He crawled out the north side, moving fast but low, keeping the Winchester close. He sprinted 20 yards and dove behind a fallen tree, chest heaving as rifle cracks tore through the jungle. The Japanese were firing at sound, not targets, blind volleys into the water-filled ditch, bullets slicing through mud, splintering bark, and kicking up geysers of dirt. Harper rose slowly behind the log and brought the scope to his eye. Movement 50 yards out, 2 soldiers advancing cautiously toward the ditch, rifles up, fingers tight on their triggers. Harper steadied himself, set the crosshairs on the lead soldier's sternum, and fired. The man dropped immediately. The second soldier dove behind a stump. Harper shifted his sight line, but before he could fire again, more voices appeared behind him east, closer, too close. They were flanking him. Harper slipped back into the undergrowth, crouched low, and ran north. Jungle brush slapped against his legs. Vines tugged at his gear. His boots sank into the soft ground. Gunfire followed him, rifle shots cracking past his ears, rounds tearing through the foliage. He kept moving, counting the seconds, focusing on terrain. No panic, no wasted motion. At 10:43, he dove into another shell crater, this one dry, shallow, and partially shielded by fern growth. The noise behind him faded. The Japanese had stopped pursuit, regrouping around their dead and assessing the direction of his escape. Harper checked the Winchester. Mud streaked the stock. Water dripped from the barrel. The bolt felt gritty. He pulled it back slowly, ensuring no mud had fouled the chamber. 2 rounds. Enough to survive if he stayed hidden. Not enough to fight a patrol. At 11:13, after nearly half an hour of controlled breathing and careful listening, Harper rose from the crater and moved northeast toward American lines, staying low and zigzagging through the groves. By 11:17, He reached the perimeter, breath ragged, uniform soaked, boots filled with mud. A Marine sentry challenged him, lowering his rifle only when Harper spoke his name. Harper walked straight to battalion headquarters. He didn't boast, didn't exaggerate. He simply reported the facts. 11 snipers in 4 days. 5 infantry down during escape. 2 rounds remaining. The commander stared at him for a long moment. The rifle everyone mocked was now the most lethal weapon on the ridge, and the man who carried it had become the most dangerous soldier in the battalion. Harper's report spread through the battalion faster than any official dispatch ever could. By midday, men from companies A through F had drifted toward headquarters in quiet clusters, whispering the number 11. 11 snipers in 4 days. Nobody said it loudly, nobody joked. It wasn't the kind of achievement that drew applause. It was something heavier, something the battalion understood instinctively. One man with an unissued rifle had solved a problem that had cost them 14 lives. The commander didn't call it heroism. He called it necessity. The groves west of Point Cruz had stalled operations for nearly a week. Every patrol dispatched into that labyrinth of banyan trunks risked losing men before they even saw the enemy. Sniper fire came without warning, without direction, without pattern. The battalion had been fighting shadows. Harper had given the shadows shape. By early afternoon of January 19th, the immediate threat had been eliminated. No more rifle cracks from treetops. No more sudden collapses of men on water runs or ration details. No more patrols freezing at the sound of snapping branches overhead. The groves were still dangerous. Everything on Guadalcanal was, but the constant tension, the dread that came from invisible rifles hidden 60 to 90 feet above the jungle floor had vanished. Harper didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired, the kind of tired that lived somewhere behind the eyes, deeper than muscle or bone. He sat on an ammunition crate while a corpsman cleaned the cuts on his hands, picking gravel and splinters from knuckles scraped raw during the escape. The Winchester lay across Harper's knees, mud drying in dark streaks across the stock. He ran a cloth over the metalwork in slow, deliberate motions. Other soldiers passed by and looked at the rifle. Their expressions were complicated, respect mixed with disbelief. A few nodded at Harper when their eyes met. None stayed long. Praise in the middle of a campaign felt misplaced, almost dangerous. Men died the day after being called heroes. The battalion commander, Major Ellsworth, stepped out of his tent. He didn't ask Harper to stand at attention. He simply motioned him inside. Maps hung over the interior, dotted with colored pins marking Japanese defensive lines, American positions, and suspected movement routes. A chart listing casualties was pinned near the entrance. Ellsworth closed the flap behind them. "Sit down, Harper." Harper remained standing. Ellsworth didn't insist. Instead, he folded his arms, studying the man who had walked back into camp with mud up to his chest, 2 rounds left, and a rifle the armourer once mocked as a sporting piece. "You understand what you've done," Ellsworth said quietly. Harper shook his head. "Just did my job, sir." "No," Ellsworth replied. "You changed the battalion's situation. Those men were bleeding us 1 shot at a time. You ended that." The major stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I want you to train others." Harper blinked. "Sir? We have 14 Springfield rifles with Unatal scopes, sniper rifles left behind by the Marines, and we have 40 men in the regiment who qualified expert before deployment." He paused. "I want you to teach them how to do what you did." Harper glanced down at the Winchester, the mud-spattered stock, the glass of the Noske scope pitted with tiny spots of dried rain, the rifle that had been laughed at, doubted, dismissed. "Condition," Harper said softly. "I keep this one." Ellsworth nodded without hesitation. "It's yours." The conversation ended. Orders would follow in writing, but both men understood. Yesterday, Harper had been a rifleman with an odd choice of weapon. Today, he was the foundation of a sniper program. As Harper left headquarters, the sun dipped behind the western tree line, casting long, uneven shadows across the groves, the same groves that had held killers in their branches just a day earlier. The silence felt different now, Not ominous, not hunted, just quiet, the kind of quiet earned the hard way. Harper walked back toward his tent with the Winchester slung over his shoulder. The rifle everyone mocked had changed the course of their fight, and the men who once joked about it now watched him pass with something close to awe.